If you had met me in early elementary school, you would have said I was a very social child. I was active, I was engaged, I was very physical, I traveled among several circles of friends in the neighborhood and from school, and I was always exploring something, usually on a bicycle someplace where I wasn't supposed to be. And if you had met me in the last couple years of elementary school, you would have said I was a very lonely child, almost friendless, always with my head down, unable to meet people's eyes, depressed and not very present. Now, a lot of things happened to create that situational loneliness. And though this time of my life was very short and done with just a few years later when I found my middle school people, which was important, I never forgot what it was like to be that lonely. It stayed with me. It was something I never wanted to repeat. Now, among the many epidemics that we're living among is one of loneliness, as Jim mentioned. This is an epidemic that preceded COVID-19, and it has been, over time, changing the way that loneliness is seen in our culture and changing the very nature of who is lonely. It used to be that studies revealed that the last years of life were probably our loneliest time, and they still really, truly can be, which is why we work very hard here to counter that and be a multi-generational community. And yet it is also the case that our newest data shows that it's just as likely now, and in fact more likely, that our youth and young adults will be among our loneliest people. And that is one of the reasons that we work so hard to be a multi-generational community here, because we also need to counter that. Now, why should we worry about loneliness? I have a slide that I'm going to see if I can get up there in a minute. So there are many different kinds of loneliness, and here's the thing I want to say, that the kind of episodic loneliness that I experienced as a kid is something that almost all of us have experienced. I had a rather long stint of it, actually, but that's something we all mainly know. But there is also a kind of chronic loneliness that can be even more difficult. And when things happen, we might have that episodic loneliness, the one at the top here. That's when you move, as I did, and you start a new school in a less idyllic place with more things going on in your family. You lose someone you love, or you go through a pandemic. Yet what we started seeing even years before that was more chronic loneliness, that bottom section there, something that's a close neighbor of despair, despair being the loss of all hope. Now, Jon Cacioppo and William Patrick have defined loneliness as perceived social isolation, and we'll come back to that in a minute. Cacioppo explains that we're a social species, and we derive our strength not as we think from our rugged individualism, but rather from our ability to plan and communicate and create and work and be together with others. One reason we should pay attention to loneliness, he says, is that loneliness is a warning bell. It says danger is out there. If we start to feel lonely, it's worth paying attention to. And that danger has been documented by many studies, from the Cleveland Clinic to the Annals of Harvard, which have tracked the fact that loneliness ends up giving us that last section there, which is many physical and emotional outcomes. It can risk our minds, and it can risk our literal physical hearts, among other organs. So we can let that slide go. But as we think about it, there's one study that was published in the Harvard Business Review, keep that in mind for a second, and it showed that living with obesity increases your chance of dying early by 20%. Living with chronic loneliness increases your chance of dying early by 45%. Now, that study concluded that loneliness is a greater risk to us than depression, dementia, heart disease, or anxiety. But again, I said that study was in the Harvard business review. And why was that? It's because the study's author, Dr. Vivek Murthy, said that loneliness was also shown to reduce the ability of one to perform our tasks at work. It short-circuits our creativity. It impairs other aspects of our executive functioning, like decision-making and reasoning. It has all kinds of short-term as well as long-term impacts. Now, Mashim Akita of the East Bay Meditation Center, who's a Buddhist teacher and also a movement builder in Oakland, says that the first step of addressing the suffering of loneliness is to acknowledge that one is lonely, which seems pretty easy except for one thing. Now, Kachapo agrees. He says, denying that you feel lonely makes no more sense than denying you feel hungry. You just have a basic need, in this case for socialization, that you don't have met. And Akita says to be part of that acknowledgement is to name, for many of us, and our beautiful song today by Namali Brennett names so many of them, the structural issues which keep one isolated. And sometimes those include things like racism or heteronormativity or ableism. So for some whose chronic isolation is because of these larger forces, they may need to start by naming that as well. Now, when the shelter-in-place order was coming in 2020, and we all knew it was coming, what kept flashing through my head were those really painful years when I was in 4th and 5th grade. I realized that I had this deep, ingrained fear of loneliness. As that childhood experience of being lonely, as I said, I didn't want that to happen again. It was very motivating to not want to feel that again. So one of the things I did was to make sure that I had a couple people that it was okay to say, however often I needed to, that there were parts of this experience that really sucked and that I really hated and that I was feeling lonely. And they weren't people who would feel like they needed to fix it for me. And that was critical in that time. Now, we're here as a faith community, and I will say as spiritual beings, we need to connect with others in meaningful ways where we can share our dreams and hopes, where we can be together at the deepest levels. And the opportunity to be ourselves or to grow into ourselves with others around us, to encourage us and help us, is an amazing gift. And this needs to be seen as a need for everybody, no matter what our identities, no matter what our experiences, no matter what's just happening to us in the moment, because that episodic loneliness can become a path to the more chronic loneliness. What is making the epidemic of loneliness not pass among us is that it's often accompanied with other things. And I've got another slide about this one, like shame or stigma. Being lonely in our culture isn't just about being lonely. It's about the fact that we are supposed to be able to be connected at all times. And the fear of falling into the category of even being a lonely person is something that we fear. How many of you just hesitated before even showing up for service today? Those of you that read about what the topic was. Now, Mashim Akita says that another step towards moving from the silent isolation of loneliness back into the laughter of community is to stop catastrophizing with ourselves about what loneliness means, the way I did when that shelter-in-place loomed. And Akita also suggested that we address individual feelings that we might have of grief and shame, and to find someone we can talk to about those. Regular practices of gratitude help, she says, and acknowledgement of others, as well as taking an active interest in people other than yourself, which when we're feeling stressed or lonely can be hard to do. In other words, it's important to be able to tell people you're feeling lonely. It's also important to ask them how they're doing, so that they feel like there's an exchange there as well. As we come out of this very unusual time with this outsized urgency towards connection and some wariness, knowing that maybe we're not really emerging 100% the way we were before, I think it's important for us to recognize that taking the risks of connection, whatever they are for you, and I want to really acknowledge that I value every person who's on our stream today as well, because I know for some people it's still not safe to be in this sanctuary. So thank you for connecting that way as well. But whatever it means for you, that first risky action could be the path to greater health, and to greater wholeness. I particularly love about the way in our community there are so many ways to connect. I think, though, before we talk about that, we have to talk about that part of us that doesn't want to admit that we're lonely, and in doing so keeps us isolated, keeps us from taking that risk, keeps us from taking that next step and moving forward. Here is the thing about being lonely that I have learned, is that we're all in really good company. There are many, almost everybody experiences loneliness at some time, and actually the people that you would think are not lonely are often the ones that are. And that's an interesting thing. There's an interesting Australian podcast series called We Are Lonely, in which they interview artists and musicians and others about the way that loneliness affects their art. And in one episode, an Australian rock star talks about his life and says that the loneliest moment in his life over and over again is when he finishes a film and the harsh demands of his crazy schedule end, and there he is, all of a sudden, just by himself. Some of us have felt that after an intense workday or an intense period of pushing in some project that we care about. He says in those moments he feels deeply, deeply lonely, a man with thousands of followers. And one other artist who is Indigenous talks about the anger he feels when he talks about how racism is a cause for his loneliness and how people turn away and don't want to hear that, even though he's another person who many follow and look to for leadership. Another talks about being genderqueer and how this added a different layer to their loneliness. The funny thing is that those producing this podcast have a very animated and excited conversation. They laugh, they enjoy it, because they're talking about the common experience of loneliness. And I want to say about laughter, which is on one of those things we aim for coming out of loneliness, is that it may seem like a long journey away from where you are in those times of loneliness and isolation, yet the journey begins with just one movement: the risk of reaching out, showing up, connecting, telling someone what your burden is. I spent a lot of time thinking about why it matters to keep building what we're building here, this multi-generational, multicultural community. And one of the reasons I believe it does is so that we can counter this particular epidemic and be a place where we can listen to one another with the openness of our hearts. Again, not because we need to fix things, not because we even need to be able to relate, but because we need places where we don't have to push that loneliness, that isolation, and that fear away. We have many, many ways to do that, to fight that stigma in our mind of loneliness, everything from addictions to distractions, which have all grown more in the last years. And I'll admit here, I love my New York Times mini crossword puzzle every day, my Wordle, my Scrabble with my friend every day, my daily gratitude text that I do with another friend. I love all these digital things. I take pictures all the time. I cannot imagine living in a world that I don't have my digital devices. And yet I also know my history. And last year I began being very, very careful to put them aside, some every week, and to engage with living beings on a regular basis. Sometimes I even set goals for how much I'm going to do that. With this, I believe we can move back to laughter. And if you're feeling lonely today, and especially chronically so, I invite you to take the risk of connection, even if that means maybe just talking to one of us as the ministers here. For those of us who are not feeling lonely in this particular moment, we have a role as well. Try talking to someone new in your communities when you come, not just the people we're still so glad to see. If someone shares something that seems hard, try just hearing it and resist that urge to fix it with your next sentence. It's kind of amazing to all of us to realize, but if it could have been fixed with one sentence, the person who's sharing it with us probably would have already done that. Just saying. Our pastoral visitors were discussing just yesterday the benefit to our community if we all just said more often, I hear you. I'm here for you. Yeah, that's worth, thank you. Yeah. I want to say a word about solitude. If you were to meet me now and get to know me, you might say, that I am now a person who enjoys solitude. And solitude is very different from loneliness. It never would have been my choice, actually, maybe even 15 years ago, but it really works for me now. I spend a great deal of my time, I'm blessed to spend a great deal of my time with people, and I also have come to realize I need a time without people. But by grappling with my fear of loneliness, I was able to embrace my love of solitude and to get the nourishment that it brings to me into my life as well. Solitude is a very enlivening experience and a way to explore our own creativity, understand our own hearts, and reclaim laughter and joy. Loneliness is a form of suffering, a form we can do something about for ourselves and for others. You know, the other epidemic that we've been dealing with these last couple years is less scary for many of us because of those fortunate enough to be able to and willing to take the vaccines, which reduce many of the symptoms and make them less life-threatening. Yet, we can remember back to how much we worried about the risks of those vaccinations when they first came out. In the same way, the risk of connection is the first vaccination against the life-threatening state of loneliness that we see around us. Community is our superpower to defeat this dangerous and pernicious foe, and we can all help address this epidemic if we take the risk of connecting.